The law is a teacher. For 50 years under Roe v. Wade, the American people were taught the Supreme Court of our land says that abortion is just fine, it's up to you, and therefore, we're going to have to make moral arguments to change their hearts. Can't do everything by law. So it's going to take a lot of education, a lot of preaching. We have to understand that people have souls, and that little child, unborn child, has a soul. Not a problem, but rather it is alive.
How is the Electoral College related to abortion and other life issues? My guest, Michael Maibach from Save Our States, has a very interesting insight into the Electoral College and how the United States was actually formed. There's a lot to be known about how some of the decisions that were made back during Abraham Lincoln's presidency and, of course, the Civil War, and how those might be parallel to some of the things that we are seeing here in a post-Dobbs world, where the Supreme Court sent it back to our elected representatives. Of course, many of them are at the state and local level. Today, we have an opportunity to see how the Electoral College is critical to protecting our freedoms, protecting our freedom of speech, and of course, protecting our lives and the lives of the most innocent among us, including the preborn, their mothers, and of course, the poor. Through our discussion with Michael Maibach about some of the important issues that if protecting our Electoral College is part of protecting life here in the United States. So we're so excited to have him on the program. This is Living Pro-Life. Well, I'm so excited to have our next guest, Michael Maibach from Save Our States. Michael, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Brian. Good to be here.
Well, Michael, I know there's a lot of talk about potentially doing away with the Electoral College, and I think it's a critical component to save our country, save, of course, our states, but then also save our families and the foundation of the United States of America. So tell me a little bit about Save Our States and why it's so important.
So Save Our States was started in 2009. There's 5 of us that work at Save Our States. We were formed in a reaction to the 2006 launch of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which has been passed by 17 legislatures in our country out of the 50 and signed by those 17 governors. The compact says, no matter who wins the vote in our state, let's say California or New York, Delaware, where it's been passed as well, we will tell our president's electors to vote for whoever wins the national popular vote. And of course, that's not constitutional, but sometimes the left is all about chaos rather than constitutionality on election night. So that's what we work against. I give speeches around the country defending the Electoral College.
So tell us a little bit of history of the Electoral College. Why is it important? How did it come to be?
So in 1787, 55 founders met for 116 days in Philadelphia without air conditioning, with the windows closed and the drapes down. And they just came up with our wonderful Constitution, the world's oldest Constitution. But the last week of the Constitutional Convention, they had not decided how to elect the president. They decided on the Congress, the House and Senate, and the Connecticut Compromise. They decided on having a Supreme Court, but they didn't agree yet on the presidency. So there were 3 discussions, really. Should we have a sort of a national popular vote? No, it'd always be somebody from one of the big cities. Philadelphia was the largest city, New York, Boston, or maybe those Virginians, since Virginia was the largest state in population. Should we have the Congress elect the president? Well, then we wouldn't have an independent executive. We wouldn't have a check and balance, because they really bought into Montesquieu's book, Fear of the Law, 1748, checks and balances. So should we have each state hold votes, either in the legislature or popular votes, and then aggregate those, sort of like the World Series? You know, we have 7 games that we aggregate those. They decided, and that's what we've been doing. So people that say the Electoral College is undemocratic, we would say we have 50 Democratic votes, and we aggregate this. So we have much more democracy than most all of Europe does, for example.
Yeah. So I know there's a big attack on the Electoral College right now. Of course, you mentioned that it's from a lot of, quote, left-leaning groups. And so how would destroying the Electoral College potentially have an impact on our families, the topic of abortion or adoption or these kind of important topics?
Well, 9 of our states have half of our people. Los Angeles County has more people than 41 of our states. New York City has more people than 39 of our states. If we had a national popular vote, we wouldn't have the two parties. We would have any party of any billionaire who wanted to fly around and run for president in their jet from large city to large city. We would have the rule by the big cities. And you know how well managed and behaved the big cities are. I mean, if we look at dysfunction, the larger the city, the bigger the problems we have, because man is a creature, social creature. After a certain size, there's problems. This is why we believe in federalism. So that also means that the U.S. Senate, which has 2 votes per state, would be challenged next, which is, why don't we have a popular vote for our senators by population?
Right.
Rather than 2 senators for Wyoming and 2 for California. California maybe has 30 senators or something. Well, those states haven't proved very friendly toward human flourishing. Too bad, but they haven't. The checks and balances, federalism, this is all by way of keeping us free and making good decisions. And of course, we have a pretty friendly Supreme Court with the Dobbs decision that was appointed by Mr. Trump, his last term in office, even though he didn't win the national popular vote. Now, this last time he did, which no one expected, but he lost by 2.5 million votes, all from California, by the way. It does give a voice to the small cities, the small states, and population, and people that have a heart for this Constitution.
Yeah, I always found it interesting that Rhode Island has the same 2 votes as California or Texas or Alaska. I just recently saw Alaska apparently has a state map, and they put this tiny little, lower 45 on the bottom that not to scale. So I think that's kind of, funny. They're kind of making a laughing stock of the lower 48. But anyways, the point is you're correct. And so the Dobbs decision was a critically important pro-life decision. And it probably wouldn't have been possible without the Electoral College.
Yeah, well, it shouldn't have happened 50 years ago anyway, because it was against the Constitution. This is an issue left to the states, according to our Constitution. That abortion and marriage really were not national issues, but rather state issues. The court, starting with the Warren Court, imagine the past to remember the future, as Alexander Bickel wrote. They wanted to nationalize everything. And when you nationalize everything in a country like ours, you deeply divide people. Federalism, the 50 states, is a wonderful way to disaggregate problems. So if you don't like living in Connecticut, you can move to Florida or Tennessee. And people have been. We had 7 congressional seats move to southern and southeastern states because of population moves. The federalism of America gives people a place to go. I want to raise my family in this kind of state versus that kind of state, versus
right.
I've got to leave the country to live the way I want. So families and individuals can choose the cultures, because Texas is a very different culture than Massachusetts. God bless them both, but they're very different places, very different mindsets. Wyoming is very different than downtown New York. And people in Wyoming want to live a certain way. And so our Constitution allows for that.
Well, I know that you travel around the country and you give presentations to young people, students. A lot of times they fight back on this thing and they say, well, why? Why can't we just have a popular vote? Isn't that called democracy? Isn't it? What do you say to that?
When I speak to a lot of colleges and high schools, very often I hear from students, well, the founders were slave owners and therefore the Constitution itself is terrible. Or they didn't give women the right to vote. I hear about that as well. So my speech now includes, before I get to the Constitutional Convention, it includes pictures of rulers in 1776, King Charles in Spain, Louis XVI in France, Catherine the Great in Russia, and George III, who we had a war with, and then emperors of China and Japan. And what I point out is, in 1776, the world was full of tyranny, no freedom anywhere, and slavery in every country. So then I show slave markets in Egypt. The Jews escaped from slavery in Egypt with Passover. And I show slave trade markets in the Roman Empire. And of course, the Old Testament is full of slavery. And Brazil didn't get rid of slavery until 1888. So by doing that, I show people that the founders were born into a world full of slaves and tyrants, and they dug themselves out of that hole. They didn't get rid of slavery in one generation, but Jefferson, to his credit, began the argument that became the end of slavery. Now, we had to end it. As you read the second inaugural Lincoln is just a wonderful address with 700,000 people dying to free slaves, but we did it. And we're proud of the fact that we got rid of slavery. Women were never voting until the 20th century anywhere in the world. In 1776, there was no thought of a woman voting. Matter of fact, the whole idea was the man voted for their household. And that was quite accepted because most all people got married and the man represented his wife and children. And if he didn't have a family, then there was less representation, I guess you would say. So I show them history, and then I say to them, is there a young lady in this classroom that has 3 older brothers? There's always one. And they raise their hand, yes. And I say, well, then you know something about majority tyranny. Because the founders feared majority tyranny. And of course, any woman, any young girl with 3 brothers knows something about being the only girl. And so those are sort of things that bring to mind how to think about the founders and freedom.
Now, there's been a lot of discussion about how slavery and the abolition of slavery potentially could be paralleled to this entire abortion argument as well. Of course, we had a massive civil war to save our country from slavery. Hopefully, we don't have a civil war regarding abortion, but how is the same kind of things playing out here in modern times?
So when Lincoln was a public figure, he was in the House of Representatives just one term, and then was in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln gave great thought, as many people did in those days, to what to do about slavery. And his view was that it's in the states it's in, which was about 11 states. Those are Confederate states. And the other states are free, what we call free labor states. And he thought that the Constitution wouldn't allow us to abolish slavery, but it could stop its spread. And that was the reason the Lincoln-Douglas debates were held, because Stephen Douglas, U.S. Senator from Illinois, led the charge to pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which, in a stunning piece of legislation, said that the new states in the Union, the people will vote whether or not to have slaves. And Lincoln said that's a bridge too far. It's one thing to have inherited slavery before we were states, because in 1776, all 13 states had slaves. So we inherited this from the Europeans, from the British. They brought the slaves over, not Americans. We didn't invent slavery in 1619. They were there. But to vote to extend slavery, Lincoln said that was a bridge too far, and it destroyed Stephen Douglas's designs on the presidency, because he was seen as defeated by Lincoln in his logic and morality. We went through a civil war to end that. We're not going to do that with abortion, but what the Supreme Court in Dobbs has done is return this question to the states. But ironically, every state legislature now, or popular votes, can decide on this in a way that Lincoln would have opposed. And so I think there's a basis of saying, are we really going to ask voters to vote whether or not to kill unborn babies?
Yeah.
But the court didn't decide whether or not there were rights inside of that, inside the womb. And therefore, we're going to have to make moral arguments, and it's going to be person by person, the work you do, for example, person by person, to change their hearts, because you can't do everything by law. We have to change people's hearts about abortion so that it becomes something that is seen as so destructive of everybody involved, not only the child, but the mother and the father, if the father's aware of what's going on.
Well, in states like our state, Missouri, we had Amendment 3 that passed last November. That was a popular vote. It passed by 51.6% of the popular vote here in the state of Missouri. And we went from being one of the most pro-life states in the entire union to having a constitution that guaranteed abortion in all 9 months of pregnancy with absolutely no accountability, no licensing, no regulation, and full immunity for the abortionist and anyone involved with an abortion. And so I think this is the danger of flat-out popular votes, and this kind of thing is happening around the country. Luckily, in states like Florida, it ended up being 57% of the vote, but was held back by a 60% margin. So, these are important things.
The law is a teacher. When laws are passed, it teaches people. Buckle up, right? I mean, when seatbelts first came out, you don't remember, but I do. We had to remember to buckle our seatbelts until it became, you get a ticket if you don't wear. And so now everybody gets into a car and they automatically. So the law taught us to be safer in cars, right? For 50 years under Roe v. Wade, the American people were taught the Supreme Court of our land says that abortion is just fine. It's up to you. And if it's convenient, whatever your reason is, emotional or otherwise, or health, you can have an abortion. And so it's going to take a lot of education, a lot of one-on-one discussions, a lot of preaching. Hopefully preachers are talking about this, and a lot of citizens like you and others, groups like Coalition Life, that are talking with people about the value of human life and the creation of a soul. We have to understand that people have souls, and that little child, unborn child, has a soul. It's an image of God, not a problem, but rather it is alive.
Well, we're speaking here with Michael Maibach from Save Our States. Thank you so much for being on the program. Any last thoughts about how they can get involved with Save Our State and protect our Electoral College?
Well, my role is to give speeches either in person or online around the country. I've spoken to 22 states so far, 170 some speeches. So if any of your listeners have a civic group, large or small, that would like to have an online speech about the Electoral College or have me visit, we don't have a speaking fee. I simply ask for a parking space. That's my only request when I give a speech. And so if they would like me to come to their community, I'd be happy to discuss with them that possibility and to advance civic education about the founders' design within the Constitution.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for your work at Save Our States, and thank you for being on the program today.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. God bless.